everybody, and welcome to the Radical Candor podcast. Today, surprise, you're going to hear an episode of the Just Work podcast, which I co-host with Wesley Faulkner. We love talking about all the things that can go wrong at work and how to make them right. And today's podcast is one of the ones we're most proud of. So we're dropping this into the feed. I hope you enjoy it as much as we do. And if you do, check out other episodes at justworktogether.com/podcast. Thanks. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Just Work podcast. I am Kim Scott, and
I am Wesley Faulkner. Today, we are really excited to have Delia. Kim's been talking about the blog post that you wrote, and so hopefully we can talk about that later today. But Delia, could you please take a few moments to introduce yourself to our listeners?
Hi, I'm Delia Grenville, and so glad to be here, Kim and Wesley. Thanks for having me. I am an executive from tech. I've been working in tech for over 25 years now, and I've worked almost everything in the product development lifecycle. My passion is around how people innovate, and my career has given me the opportunity to see a lot of it successful and sometimes not so successful. So I think that was one of the reasons why when I heard Kim's recent TED Talk, I reached out to her because she sort of helped me understand some of the terrain under how teams innovate in a way that I'd never heard about it before.
And Delia, you taught me a word, mobbing, which is, now that how every once in a while you learn something new and it explains everything and you see it everywhere. So you did that for me. Thank you. We'll talk
awesome.
about that. In fact, before I jump into a reading, why don't you tell folks what mobbing is, if you don't mind?
The first thing that pops into mind is it's a TikTok challenge, right? Mobbing.
Oh, wow.
No.
It does.
Although it could be.
It could be, and it definitely has its own dance to it, but it's not the kind that we're used to. Oftentimes in organizations, people are challenged or don't know how to react to a new team member or a different team member. Someone thinks differently. And instead of doing all the great things that we know in Radical Candor, they instead get very silent and gossipy and sort of join together in a group kind of way to target this person and remove them from the situation. And the reason why they want to do this, and that's one of the key tenets, is they're trying to go back to the status quo. Everything was perfect before so-and-so arrived, and if we can only go back, then everything would be perfect. But oftentimes that person's hired into the organization to help change, to make that mandate move forward. So it's an interesting phenomenon. We know it's there, but it's not often named. Like, all of us know exactly what it is when we hear it, and we're like, oh, it had a word.
Yeah. And my guess is, in the research, it's more likely to happen to someone from a historically marginalized community than someone who is from a historically advantaged community. Is that correct?
It has some of that component, but not always. So much, not as much as we would think. It really happens mostly to people who are ambitious.
Yeah.
And then we know that ambition component is mapped on to being in a marginalized community, because oftentimes the way you compete is through ambition. So that's why I think we would see that more so than the main factor is ambition. It's this, and not blind ambition, but ambition that makes other people say, well, this is not the way we were doing the work before. Yeah. And so then that makes people...
So it's more around change and innovation than it is around identity.
Cheese mover.
Yeah. Exactly. Who moved my cheese? I love it. Okay, well, we're going to talk more about that. But if you don't mind, I've got a reading from the book formerly known as Just Work, now known as Radical Respect. And it's a little bit of a longer one, but basically what we've been doing up till now is sort of outlining a framework that explains the difference between bias, prejudice, and bullying, and then what happens when you layer power on top and you get discrimination, harassment, and physical violations, and the different roles that we all play. And so this is a reading from the chapter on what leaders can do to prevent those things from happening in their organizations. And I hope that you and Wesley will give me some radical candor. Tell me what doesn't work about this.
I'm ready to rip you apart.
Yeah, rip it apart. All right. Bill Walsh, the former head coach of the San Francisco 49ers, explained in his book, The Score Takes Care of Itself, that his job was to win football games, but he couldn't win those games if he focused too much on the score. The score was a lagging indicator of what he was doing well or badly as a coach. He needed to go to back up and understand the leading indicators, behaving ethically, demanding high standards, holding people accountable, and teaching players the right way to play. Note that good teamwork, caring about one's colleagues, goes hand in hand with holding people accountable. Bias, prejudice, and bullying cause unethical behavior, lower standards, and prevent accountability and harm collaboration. All of these things will prevent you from achieving your goals. Of course, it's not your fault as a leader that bias, prejudice, and bullying are so common, but you're the boss, and so it is your problem. It's not your job to make the whole world just, but it is your job to make your little corner of the world as fair as possible. You can't do it by yourself or by executive order. You're going to need your team's help, and getting that help will require you to make it safe for them to challenge both you and each other. This requires what psychologist Jennifer Fried calls institutional courage. Institutional courage is a leadership commitment to seek the truth and to take action on behalf of those who trust or depend on the institution, even when it's unpleasant, difficult, and costly. Institutional courage requires proactive action. For example, creating systems by which employees can raise concerns without fear of being punished, as well as responsive action. For example, responding to reports of harm forthrightly, thoroughly, and fairly. These efforts can prevent future incidents, allow people harmed to recover more quickly, increase trust between employees and leaders, and enhance the institution's overall reputation. On the other hand, institutional betrayal, for example, when an institution mistreats those who trust or depend on it, only compounds the harm to all involved. Some common forms of institutional betrayal are victim blaming, sweeping incidents under the rug, and the like. It can be tempting to engage in these behaviors as a way to save time and money or limit legal exposure. Ultimately, though, institutional betrayal harms people all over again and will harm your organization's reputation in the long run. To demonstrate institutional courage, it's not enough to demonstrate personal courage as a leader. You're human. Sometimes your courage and energy will falter or fail. You need to develop both proactive and responsive systems that will hold you and others accountable. Get started. Don't wait for reports of incidents and problems to come to you. Be proactive. All right, so lay it on me. What do you think?
Well, I think a lot of it's on point. But I want to just give you a comment when I was listening to institutional courage. I think a lot of times with HR training and systems, we are really concerned about taking action, you said, and also making it easy for people to bring forward their complaints. But we don't talk to employees about taking ethical action.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a qualifier there that kind of feeds into this notion of institutional betrayal, where mobbing often lives.
Yes.
Right? It's not only is the person being, bullied or mobbed. I don't want to say bullied, but this workplace group aggression that you can't really put your finger on. Not only is that happening to them, but when they go to the institution to say, it's kind of weird, I feel like this thing's happening. How do you like report manipulative insincerity? It's silent, it's gossip,
it's really hard.
Yeah, exactly. So you do sound a little wackadoo, right? So you go there and you're not in this place. You're not in a way, you cannot exactly explain what's happening to you. So you've got that component to it in the betrayal. But then what I've noticed with groups who mob targets is they actually leverage these same HR systems.
Yes.
And they report actions that aren't ethical in a way that isn't ethical, right? But they're not held accountable to it, because if you're going just by the tick marks, Kim and Wesley, you're supposed to report, and you're supposed to report quickly. You're not actually supposed to report accurately.
Yes.
You should. We believe you should. We put that in the fine print, but there's no like real accountability around that one.
That is a really important point. That is a really, really important point. I can think of an example of that happening to a leader who I knew who was making a lot of change in his organization, and someone who didn't like that change created a Facebook group, and then they started making stuff up and reporting it in the HR system, and this big investigation ensued, and it was very difficult for him to protect himself.
I think that's what you're pointing out is also where it's hard when every individual incident itself might sound, but sound like off or attacking or just not right. But in these situations, you almost have to look at it as totality. You have to look at a string, and you have to look at a pattern of behavior. And the Bill Walsh example, talking about how the lagging indicators and leading indicators of how you need to weed out some of that bad behavior, that kind of weird environment, and where people do not feel welcome, in order for that outcome, that ultimate outcome, to actually show itself. Some of the, when I was thinking about difficulties in my past, some of the simplistic nature of how people approach things, it really shows that if you don't take the steps that are needed to get to the outcome and deal with all of the details, that even though that you put something into motion and you feel like it's directly addressing the thing that you're trying to influence, how it is temporary in the way that it shows itself. For instance, I was in a job where I was a marketer, and my manager at the time, we were running a promotion, and they had me go to all these communities and just post a promotion there, like spammy behavior. And it was saying, buy our thing, buy our thing, buy our thing. But real marketers are the ones that are able to understand the nuance of the message and saying, find the people, find what they need, and then change your message to really address their needs. And it is multiple steps into really getting to the point where you actually see those results. And in the mob behavior or mob mentality, the way that you describe it, the mobbing, it's rejecting things that might challenge the status quo, because there is the same kind of thinking of, this is the way you do things because we're trying to do things. It's the simplest explanation. And so the mobbing goes into the whole, this is how we do things because this is how we have been doing things, and this is kind of the thing that we're used to. And so I do like the story, the reading, and it kind of like ties it all together of what you're explaining, because the change maker or the person making things better, even though they're trying, like you mentioned, the HR example, it's hard to explain, but it is also kind of like a part of the willingness to say, like, I'm hired to make this company better. I'm not hired to kind of like push people down or to put people out of a job. I want to make this better. And so I think the reading and the example are just different sides of the same coin. So I think it's amazing how those worked out together.
I have a question, which is, how do you, for either of you, but how can you design systems that simultaneously sort of cherish the whistleblower and also hold the whistleblower accountable for not lying.
Yeah, I think a lot of it goes back to also how do we train the whistleblower? Because I think we need to level up our whistleblowing, at least in organizations, and especially in organizations like in the tech world, because it's simply just not enough to, we were really concerned about the psychological safety of whistleblowers, which I think is number one. Like on the Maslow's hierarchy of whistleblowing, that's got to be the foundational thing, right? You need to be able to come there and be safe and whatever. And so we haven't really thought about the rest of the triangle in some ways, right? How do we train you to understand, well, why are you doing this whistleblowing? A lot of times what I observed, because I didn't mention this in the intro, but I am a certified coach from New Ventures West, and we talk a lot about integrating people's entire life from that. And a lot of times, the way you're being triggered at work is the way you've been triggered elsewhere. It's not necessarily the change at work, as Wesley was mentioning, that's making you feel that way. It's your reaction to change because you've never had another way to react to change, right? So part of that, as you said, Kim, is your boss's responsibility to help you manage through that. But, bosses are human and often there's a lot of people. It's hard to have get right to the conversation. And because we've prioritize that whistleblowing psychological safety, sometimes some folks might go to the whistleblowing before they go to the manager, and it's actually an opportunity for personal development for them. But instead they've leaned to the system. Do you know what I mean? And which makes them sort of not even see themselves and the opportunity to grow themselves, but instead they're attached to this whole mechanism of reporting, complaining, all of those kinds of things, which if we're talking about ethical action, ethical complaints, we actually maybe do a disservice to that whistleblower as well, because we don't give them a chance to grow the way they should.
It's extremely messy. Because there's sometimes you want to just there's attribution bias that I think people struggle with. This person is doing this because of this, instead of actually, this is the thing that I observe. But on the HR side, I think there's also, like, from a person who has tried to report things to HR as well, there's not a realization that there's sometimes, or oftentimes, there's not a perfect victim. So I know that I've been questioned on, am I performing? What are other avenues that I use to try to raise this issue? So the assumption that the manager themselves have your best interests at heart, and so maybe it's my misunderstanding. I think the delicate balance between the two, saying that there could be bad actors on both sides, but the question is, how do we sort it out by looking at the power dynamic is something that often gets missed. But I think inherent to your question, Kim, is that the system itself wants things to be fair. And I think not all systems are created equal. And in my heart of hearts, I wish that was a concern that most companies had, was making sure that the systems are fair and that the whistleblower should be protected.
Yeah, so the whistleblower needs to be protected, and the investigation process needs to be fair. And so I mean, as a general rule, my default is to cherish the whistleblower, listen to the whistleblower. But there certainly are times where the whistleblower is ganging up is mobbing instead of really blowing a whistle, and that's why a fair investigative process needs to be in place, and that is easier said than done. I mean, those kinds of, I can't think of a single moment in my career where an investigative process I felt great about, I'm sure that there are companies out there that have good investigative processes, but I just haven't experienced one.
Yeah, and
Same.
I think we also come in to, like, we want it simplified, right? Work's so busy. So as we said, Wesley, we want a perfect victim, a perfect target,
Yeah.
you know what I mean?
It's
A
not the
perfect
case.
resolution, and everything. But that's just not how it works. And it especially doesn't work that way as as we require these more complex teams for these more complex ideas, right? So that's why I feel like, when you were reading Bill Walsh's thing, he said the score is the lagging indicator. I kind of feel like the system is the lagging indicator in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Once there's been a report, things have gone badly wrong.
I just wanted to pivot real quickly to like the blog that I wrote, in that what amazed me in watching The Bear for the first time a week ago, which was now
I haven't watched. Should I watch?
Oh, for sure. It's my new topic. It's my new topic du jour.
Oh, good.
But what amazed me is that writers can write the situation, Kim. Like, they write the situation where everyone's tense. They don't like the changes and the transformations that you're making. They don't talk to you. They sideswipe and they talk to each other and whatever. They can write it. So that means we've all seen it. We all know it. We're familiar. And part of the tension of that particular show, I don't want to spoiler for everybody, is this feeling of, because we all know that doomsday feeling, like we've seen Mean Girls, we know how the thing goes, right? So, but what amazed me this time is I realized, wow, if writers can write us in, then there's no reason that we as a story being can't live ourselves out of it.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying?
I love that.
And so then how do we do that?
And how do we do that?
Part of it is these kinds of conversations.
Yeah.
Part of it is naming and labeling things. Like, now we have words like, radical candor, mobbing. We have all of these words for things we didn't have words for before. So I think that makes a difference. And then when you have words, then you can make distinctions, right? You're saying, well, you know what? This is just group aggression. We need these stories to be told more, and get them out of the dark corners and sort of into the light, so we can, in that psychological safety of being able to report what's truly happening to you in the organization. We don't have to tell just the foundational perfect story. We can actually tell a little complex, messy story that includes some of the things that we actually did too, and feel safe about, helping the organization succeed, right? Because I loved what you said about Bill Walsh. He was here to win football games. We're all on the team to win, right? So when 3 people walk out, that affects the organization and sort of moves us away from what our common goal was, which was to win.
Yeah. I love that.
I got to say that the as a person who's moved, it's sometimes scary if you have a neighbor who, let's say at midnight, has a roaring party and it's loud, and you have a choice to make. Do you walk over and ask nicely for them to lower the music? Or do you call the cops anonymously and they don't know who's complaining? And if you go over and you ask them nicely and politely and it doesn't go well, then that kind of sours a relationship. But if you call the cops, you don't have to deal with that. And it's almost the same when you have a manager.
When you become a leader of an organization, very often I think you become like a projection screen for everyone's unresolved authority issues. And that's uncomfortable, and it's not your fault, but once again, it is your job. And so part of the work of being a leader is to earn the trust of the people who you're leading, and to prove to them that you're not going to retaliate if they do come and give you some critical feedback.
Yeah. I love that you brought in the word trust too, because when you were telling Bill's story as well, that trust element is so huge. And First, you have to trust to be able to come forward. Then you have to trust how the message will be received. Then you need to trust that there could be a resolution. And, oftentimes we don't want to talk about those touchy-feely things, right?
Mm-hmm.
We feel like, oh, yeah, trust.
Yeah.
But we don't actually talk about what that word feels like to everyone and where they experience it in their physical selves, as well as where they experience it in the timeline of their lives. Like
Yes.
when you learn to trust, and how you learn to trust also impacts how you work with trust as an adult and in a team.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, Delia, I bet you've got a good story about having dealt with mobbing or some other version of bias, prejudice, bullying. I think of mobbing as kind of almost a form of group bullying, but you wanna lay a story on us?
Sure. And I want to actually tie the story back a little bit to what you asked about at the beginning.
Okay.
You asked a really good question: is mobbing happening to people in marginalized groups? And I'm learning a lot from reading your book, and I think yes. I mean, in one of my experiences as a manager, looking back now, I realized that when we're in the situation, and people might not be able to see, but maybe they go on LinkedIn, but I am a Black woman, Canadian, Caribbean descent, right? So in tech. And we're in the situation of leadership. We're often, there's very few of us. I've worked in organizations where we're just 24 at the senior levels, et cetera. It's not a lot of people. And there's an expectation that we're going to bring up and move up others in our demographic. And I'm totally fine with that. But what I learned thinking back on your book, and what caused a sort of a mobbing situation for me in one organization, is the people that I moved up in my so-called demographic, and I really wanted to do that for DEI reasons and all of those kinds of things, had also been getting feedback from their majority demographic people, managers, which were in the ruinous empathy domain.
Yeah.
So I think I'm getting like this popping person, whatever, because everyone's really careful, Kim and Wesley, around that DEI domain. They don't want to tell a woman something. They don't want to tell her, the story, right?
Yes.
And so I think I'm getting this worker who is like, all firing and are firing on all cylinders, I meant to say. But I'm not getting that because they haven't really gotten great feedback from their work. Yeah. And in this particular situation, it did set up a mobbing scenario, because when I started to give honest feedback in all the ways that I could, following, all the parameters that I could, it wasn't taken positively, because it was the only time that person had gotten that kind of feedback.
Yeah.
And instead of thinking, well, why was that? That was the culture of the organization. And I get that. And also when you're in change and transformation, I get all of those things that were also fueling it. But the person went to gossip. And there was a place that they could be heard there, right?
Yeah.
And so that sort of fueled the whole thing. So, I really picked through that situation, because I saw, wow, it started really in ruinous empathy for this employee. And they moved into my Radical Candid organization, but didn't know how to handle the feedback, because in some of the examples that you gave, when the person was dropping the ball, it was new to them.
Yeah. And that is so, it is unfortunately very common where you have a systemically advantaged boss, shall we? And I'd love some thoughts on the use of language. Like, is that the right way to, I like the term. Sometimes I used to use overrepresented and underrepresented. And a lot of people didn't like that. So now I'm saying systemically advantaged boss. So you've got a white man who's the boss, let's say, just for example, and then you have an employee who's not a white man. And the boss is reluctant to give feedback to that employee because they're afraid of getting, quote unquote, and they'll say this often sort of explicitly, I'm afraid of getting in trouble with HR. And David Thomas, who's the president of Morehouse College, wrote this great essay about protective hesitation. This is like this where the historically advantaged leader fails to give feedback to someone who is from a historically disadvantaged group because they don't want to be called sexist or racist or whatnot, and then they do the sexist or racist thing by not giving the feedback. Because Claude Steele writes about this as well, and it calls it stereotype threat, and he did this in this book, Whistling Vivaldi, which is such a beautiful book. But he writes about this experiment where he got a group of white students and he told them that they were going to talk to other students about affirmative action. And then he asked them to set up chairs. And in some cases, he told them they were about to talk to other white students. And in other cases, he told them they were going to talk to black students. And when the white students thought they were going to talk to black students about affirmative action, they set the chairs up further apart than, I read that. I was like, oh my gosh, I can imagine all too easily imagine that happening. And that is another example of what Claude Steele calls stereotype threat, where you're so afraid of doing the thing that your group is often accused of doing that you then do the thing. And so I think it's really important what you're talking about. And there's another, I think, aspect to that problem that you're talking about that at least I've experienced, and I wonder whether you all have too in different ways. But as a white woman, for people listening who can't tell what I look like, I have often been asked to give feedback to other women because their boss, who's a man, and so now I'm like, I'm being asked to do extra work because these leaders are afraid to do their work, and that doesn't feel like I'll do it for the sake of the employee, but it's sort of annoying.
Yeah, but it's also
actually.
Oh, sorry, Wesley. No, but I'm saying also it goes back to that hierarchy triangle that we're building, right? We're not also making it safe for that manager to give that feedback.
Yes.
And we need to think about that too, because why do they need an intermediary?
Yeah, well, they don't, but they feel they do. You're right.
They feel afraid, right? And how are we supposed to do great work when we're feeling afraid at all these crazy different levels? Like whether we're right or not, we can't be in fear.
Yeah. I guess, what I tell not too long ago, I was talking to a group of CEOs and who were mostly white men. And one of them said, I'm not going to give feedback to some of my employees because I'll get in trouble with HR. And my response was, first of all, who does HR report to? You. So you're not going to, to say you feel afraid is not right. You feel uncomfortable. And there's a world of difference to me in feeling afraid and feeling uncomfortable. And as a leader, it's your job to embrace the discomfort and push on. The only way out is through. But maybe I'm not being sympathetic enough to
I think you are saying perfectly. A lot of people don't know the difference between fear and discomfort. It feels the same to them, right?
Yeah.
So that's their personal development to go through the discomfort of it. But we're still trying to build products and make services while all of this is going on.
Yeah. No, it's hard. It's hard.
And also, if they identify as an issue, I feel that people feel that issue is permanent. They don't do the work to follow up saying, I'm going to find a way to solve this problem, either my discomfort, or if I can't find the way to talk to them directly, find another way, which I guess that's why people approach you to hand off that message to someone else who is also a woman. But it needs to be, there needs to be either, is it systematic? Is it is it formulaic? Meaning, like, if there's a template for giving feedback, maybe it's in stars, or maybe it's in thumbs ups or something like that. A way to find a way to, like, do it so that there is either a guardrail in developing a system to make sure that the feedback is given, it doesn't go into a place where it could be problematic, or does it fall into a place where, if there is how the person receives it, if there's a way to, like, either challenge it or a structure into addressing some of the issues that are being brought up. If going and giving feedback feels like it's dangerous for the person who's in power, the person in power can also develop a way to figure out how to fix that problem.
Yes.
Yeah. Kim, I want to ask you a question, or at least just finish off part of that story, which was every director or a senior manager who had worked with a variety of these employees had given me feedback that was counter to what was written in the HR system. Yeah, that kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
So, and you know, in code words, like, they're very efficient, but they can be polarizing, right?
Oh gosh.
Yeah, all those kinds of things. And then it's really hard, as you all know, as you know, as you sit in your marginalized groups, because you're trying to also protect people from that. So you don't know how much of it is, like, rhetoric and how much of it is actual true.
Yeah. And in those situations, I think there's a lot of aspects to it that are complicated. One is if you sense that the real feedback that's not getting into the HR system is not actually feedback, but it's bias. To say this person is polarizing. I mean, often when someone says that, what they mean is this person doesn't look like the others in the group, and so it's uncomfortable. And that's not polarizing. That's like the problem. So is that bias masquerading as feedback? And if so, then you've got some feedback to give to the leader. But if it's sort of good performance feedback that would help the person, then you got to give the feedback to the leader. Well, why didn't you tell the person? Like, why didn't you write it in the, and maybe there's a problem with the HR system, but at the very least, that leader should be talking, should be giving the development feedback to the person so that they can improve.
Yep, there you go. That's the complexity of life.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
It'd be nice if there was a third party, like, don't allow this conversation without a facilitator as well. Someone who can evaluate the words, either, like, I think you bring up Texio a lot, that be able to look at the way the words are structured and be kind of like in the middle between the person receiving and giving the feedback to make sure that things are working the way they should.
Yeah, I mean, I really, when I was writing Radical Respect, I hired Breeze Harper, who's a critical race theorist and who was sort of my bias buster. And that was really helpful because I'm white, my editor's white, like, we missed some stuff. And Breeze read and caught it immediately. And that was really helpful. So if folks can swing that, if they have budget for that, it's really, really helpful.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. And thank you so much for teaching me about mobbing. I've learned a ton from you about it.
Well, I really hope that we can live in a world where we see less of it and that we know some of those behaviors and we can nip them in the bud earlier, and have the conversations that really help us do the work that we all want to do. We spend a lot of time at work. We should be focused on the things that we want to achieve.
Yes, totally agree.
And if you would like to share a new word for us, please send that over to hello@justworktogether.com. And we would love to be able to feature that and share that knowledge with other people listening to the show. And if you have feedback for us, non-biased, hopefully, please use the podcast that you're listening to, the application, to give us a rating or a review, because we would love to see that, to see how we're doing in our performance plans.
Thanks so much. Take care, everyone. Be well.
The Radical Candor podcast is based on the book Radical Candor, Be a Kick-Ass Boss Without Losing Your Humanity by Kim Scott. Episodes are written and produced by Brandy Neal, with script editing by me, Amy Sandler. The show features Radical Candor co-founders Kim Scott and Jason Rosoff and is hosted by me, still Amy Sandler. Nick Carissimi is our audio engineer. The Radical Candor podcast theme music was composed by Cliff Goldmacher. Follow us on LinkedIn, Radical Candor the company, and visit us at radicalcandor.com.